Hello, and welcome to the Folklore and Fiction podcast. My name is Kelly MacCath-Moran. I'm a PhD candidate in the Folklore Department at Memorial University of Newfoundland, and I'm also a speculative fiction writer under the pseudonym C.S. MacCath. The Folklore and Fiction podcast and Dispatch synthesize these passions with a focus on folklore scholarship aimed at storytellers. You'll find the Folklore and Fiction archive along with the rest of my work online at folkloreandfiction.com. Interested listeners will find a link to the current dispatch in the show notes, where a more comprehensive record of this episode can be found, including a bibliography and other references. This episode of the Folklore and Fiction podcast was first published as a newsletter in July 2020. I'm recording it as a supplemental podcast now so that new listeners and subscribers have an opportunity to engage with the material. In it, I'm writing about material culture, with help from the Library of Congress American Folklife Center, scholars Judith Farquhar and Simon Bronner, The Joy of Vegan Baking, and the 2005 science fiction film Serenity. I'm also discussing the use of material culture in storycraft and providing you with an exercise on the topic. Folkloric discussion of material culture. Folkloric studies of material culture address the design, manufacture, use, and meaning of things, folk art, food, monuments and tombstones, textiles, tools, toys, vehicles, vernacular architecture, and so on. Folklorists also care about variations in makers and groups, variations over time and place, and issues of agency, conflict, and power as they relate to these things. Above all else, we care about the human context in which an item of material culture is situated, and we strive to understand the item and context together. For example, the photo of a stovetop, teapot, and cast-iron pan of cornbread in the dispatch is merely a collection of objects until I tell you the cast-iron pan belonged to my Appalachian grandmother, who often made cornbread in it. I might further contextualize the pan and its contents by telling you that my grandmother didn't care for sweet cornbread and had no palate for spicy foods, but my cornbread contains a product I buy from a local family called cowboy candy, which is made by preserving jalapeno peppers in simple syrup and other ingredients. I might conclude by telling you that while my grandmother used buttermilk in her cornbread recipe, I'm vegan and use a combination of oat milk and apple cider vinegar instead. If you were a folklorist, you might recall that objects often have an emotional presence beyond their physical presence, and conclude that the cast-iron pan is just such an object, since the act of baking cornbread in it reminds me of my grandmother. You might also use something like Judith Farquhar's list of questions about foodways to evaluate the cast-iron pan, cornbread, and context together. In particular, you might wonder what difference it makes that food knowledge, practices, and preferences differ by time and place, and point to the shift from buttermilk to oat milk and apple cider vinegar as evidence of a shift in ethical value systems between grandmother and granddaughter. Finally, you might ask for my recipe. Here it is, adapted from the cornbread recipe in Colleen Patrick Goudreau's The Joy of Vegan Baking. Ingredients. Note, this recipe is for a big cast-iron pan, but you can have the ingredients if your pan is smaller. 3 cups oat milk, 3 tablespoons apple cider vinegar, 2 cups cornmeal, 2 cups unbleached all-purpose flour, 3 tablespoons granulated sugar, 1 teaspoon salt, 2 teaspoons baking powder, 2 teaspoons baking soda, 4 tablespoons olive oil, 1 cup whole corn kernels, and 1/2 cup cowboy candy chopped. Method: preheat the oven to 425 degrees Fahrenheit. Lightly oil a large cast-iron pan and put it in the oven while you mix the ingredients. In a small bowl, combine the oat milk and apple cider vinegar and set it aside. Mix the dry ingredients in a separate bowl. Add the milk mixture, oil, corn kernels, and cowboy candy to the dry ingredients. Pull the cast-iron pan out of the oven and fill it with the mixture. Bake 25 to 30 minutes or until the crust is golden brown and a fork inserted in the middle of the bread comes out clean. Now that you know a bit more about foodways and have a great recipe for cornbread, let's watch a short fictional food commercial and see what sort of folkloric information we might glean from it. How material culture has been used in fiction writing. Keeping in mind that folklorists analyze This episode of the Folklore and Fiction podcast is a preview, and you can listen to the full episode on the Folklore and Fiction website. Just click on the dispatch link in the show notes or go to folkloreandfiction.com and sign up for a free account. Thanks very much for your interest. Copyright 2019 to 2023. Kelly S. MacCath-Moran. All rights reserved unless Creative Commons licensing is specifically applied.